Before we get into today's episode, we just want to take a moment to invite you to our upcoming International Women's Day celebration. On March 7th, we're celebrating International Women's Day with a day of empowerment, creativity, and connection. This event is designed to uplift and inspire with engaging speakers, interactive workshops, and a welcoming community. We're thrilled to have State Representative Jillian Gilchrist join us to talk about key legislation affecting women in Connecticut. Plus, you can join sessions on setting boundaries, vision boarding, creative journaling, and trauma-informed yoga, all designed to help you grow, reflect, and recharge. There will also be a vendor marketplace, raffle giveaways, and lunch on us. And just to be clear, we define women inclusively, welcoming cisgender women, transgender women, and non-binary folks who resonate with the experiences of women. Don't miss this amazing event. Grab your spot now and read more information at the link in the description. Hope to see you there.
Dr. Vamsi Koneru is a clinical psychologist in private practice at Koneru Psychotherapy, LLC. His work focuses on the intersection of trauma and mindfulness, and he specializes in providing compassionate, evidence-based psychotherapy for adolescents, adults, and families. He's a certified mindfulness teacher with the Engaged Mindfulness Institute, an institute dedicated to supporting individuals in at-risk situations and communities that have been marginalized and underserved. Additionally, he is a member of the forensic counseling team at Community Mental Health Affiliates, Inc., an assistant professor at the University of Connecticut School of Medicine, Department of Psychiatry, and a teacher with Copper Beech Institute, a center dedicated to mindfulness practice and compassionate action. Dr. Koneru completed his MS and PhD at the University of Miami, his clinical internship at the Yale University School of Medicine, and his postdoctoral fellowship at Harvard Medical School / VA Boston Healthcare System. Welcome back, everyone, to Realizing Resilience. My name is Marisa.
And I'm Alana.
And today we have the pleasure of speaking with Dr. Vamsi Koneru. Thank you so much for meeting with us today.
Oh, what a gift to be here with you both. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. I want to start this conversation off by kind of setting the scene for your work. Your work spans a variety of settings, from private practice to teaching and forensic counseling. How does mindfulness fit into these different areas of your clinical work?
Oh, thank you for the question. Yeah, I often, when asked for definition or considerations of the interweaving of mindfulness, I'll often share a story. And really, my journeys into psychology really start at the intersections of story and science. So oftentimes how I teach is via story. I'll share anecdotes or stories about oftentimes my kids or myself, and then kind of weave it into theory, just because I feel like that sense of storytelling and vulnerability oftentimes helps us connect. So when asked about mindfulness, I often share a story where one of the first times I was asked to give any kind of talk about the science of mindfulness, an area that I'm very interested in, I was sitting in my mudroom. And it was early in my teaching, so I was feeling very, very nervous, probably even beginning to sweat a little bit in my mudroom as I was tying my shoes, walking through my slides. And at that time, my daughter, who's now 11, was maybe 2 or 3, and she was very interested in marbles, and we played with marbles and flicked them and so on. And she came into the mudroom and she was looking at me with these kind of big doe eyes like a Disney character. And she reached into her pocket and she pulls out this marble. And I'm thinking, oh, like what a delight. She's just such a delightful little person. She sees I'm nervous. She wants to give me a little reminder that she's got my back. And she looks at me and she says, you know, Dad, when people get bored by what you're saying, just let them play with this. So always humbling to have children, of course. But when I share this story, because when I think about mindfulness, I really think about it as a story of relationships. When we think about our inner world, this practice of being with our own experience, what is the relationship we have with ourself, our thoughts, our emotions, our narrative, really our way of being? What is our relationship with other people? How are we showing up within these relationships? How are we viewing other people? And really, what is our relationship with this larger world? So mindfulness, I think, of this story of relationships. And I think that's really the through line that speaks to a lot of my work, really this intersection of story, science, and relationship in connecting with individuals now in private practice. Thinking about social justice and activism has led me to kind of the intersections of our carceral system and mental health. I do a little bit of teaching as well, but at its core, really those 3 pieces: story, science, and relationship.
I love that. I think that relatability is so important to creating buy-in and also realizing that mindfulness can be kind of a part of everything and it isn't just this isolated thing you do in a moment of crisis or something like that.
Yeah, 100% agree, right? Like while it is something we try to practice, right? There is a quality of doing. I agree with you 100%. Really, it's not exclusively, or really, I don't even think of it as something like we just do as a skill or a coping mechanism. Really, a practice of being, and a practice of being awake and alive in our day-to-day lives.
So, thinking about your training, you're going to be leading trauma informed mindfulness practices for regulation and resilience, which will be on February 28th. And as mentioned, explores the theory of trauma informed mindfulness. Can you describe your teaching style and elaborate a little bit on any activities that are going to occur during the training?
Yeah, and so it would be okay. I often will share another story about a person I had the opportunity to work with. We'll call her Emily for today. In my early days, I worked at a community mental health organization. I had the opportunity to work with Emily maybe in my like third or fourth year of working there, and I was beginning to delve more deeply into mindfulness practice. And at that time, a lot of my practice was very situated in a mindfulness of the breath, where we select the breath as our object of attention, simply what we're paying attention to. Not that there's something special, if you will, about the breath, but just that it simply provides this organic object to attend to that's ever changing. So we're trying to bring attention to the breath so that attention comes out into life in that same way. We begin to see the nuance of things. So we're not just taking things like, oh, I've seen that, I've seen that. Everything starts to become a little bit more alive. So my practice was very focused on mindfulness of the breath. So I was working with Emily, who had had a very difficult life. And one of the areas we explore more in depth during the training is the concept of trauma, of course, and what is trauma. And a study that a lot of your listeners will, of course, have heard of is the ACE, or the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, which is an epidemiological study where individuals were brought in actually into a primary care clinic for um, healthcare, and they were asked a variety of questions about three main areas: abuse, neglect, and household dysfunction. And your ACE score would go up for every yes you would say to one of these things. So, anyway, so Emily's ACE score was essentially a 10, meaning she had had a very difficult life characterized by various forms of abuse, neglect, household dysfunction. So, methodically, slowly, we were getting to know one another. When I think about the work of trauma, it's really about trying to think about moving at a speed of trust, moving at a pace of connection. And so we were slowly getting to know one another. And one day she came into the waiting room and she had this football under her arm. And I was sort of playful. I'm fairly, I try not to take the work too seriously. I take like the relationship that I get to engage with quite seriously. I don't take myself particularly seriously. So as she was walking down the hallway towards my office, I kind of put my hands up and I said, "Psst," and she turned and just like fired the football at me. Thankfully, I caught it. I just started tossing the football around in the hallway. Somebody more mature must have been coming from the waiting room, and I was joking with her. I was like, "All right, run into my office. Let's go. Let's go." So we run into the office, kind of giggling to one another. We kind of start to connect a little bit more. And as we're connecting, I tell her, I've become very interested in this practice, this idea, the theory of mindfulness. And like I said at the beginning, my practice was very hinged on mindfulness of the breath. So I introduce it in that way. We share in a brief practice. Another idea that we'll explore more in depth during the training is, how do we use invitational language? Like, I'll invite you to engage in a practice as opposed to like, close your eyes. Let me invite you to find a position or place for your eyes to rest a little bit. This could be a spot 1 or 2 feet in front of the toes, or letting the eyes fully close, always leaving people in choice. So I encourage and invite her into this practice. We practice for maybe 2 or 3 or 4 minutes. As we finish, she opens her eyes and she kind of cocks her head and she looks at me. She goes, "I don't think I'm into this breathing, Vamsi." And she helped me. One of my best teachers of helping me to see that mindfulness of the breath is simply a practice, not the practice. And really, the workshop is about this exploration of what are various practices under this umbrella of mindfulness that, when working with individuals who are survivors of trauma, helps them to feel more invited into these practices, helps them to engage in practices as to avoid re traumatization. Because for some people, paying close, sustained attention to the breath could be quite dysregulating for them. Their trauma may have been associated somehow with the compromising of their breath. And so we might use different objects of attention. We might use objects of attention outside of the body, like sound, sensations in the body that are far away from the trunk, like the tips of our fingers, the tips of our toes. So the training really is about exploring in some depth fundamentally these ideas. How do we create a shared space where we feel invited to practice in ways that feel regulating for us? And then we'll explore in more theory some elements of trauma-informed mindfulness and so on. But at its core, that's really the basis of the training.
I love the phrase that you said, at the speed of trust.
Mm,
That's such a good sentence that really speaks for itself, and it's really true because you can't rush anything.
I think that's right. Yeah, absolutely. I think it's at its core, it's the sense of relationship, and another sort of an idea woven into this, piggybacking on that, is that we all have this sort of sense of like this window. Sometimes we call it a window of tolerance or range of resilience, a zone of optimal arousal. It goes by different names, but oftentimes referred to as a window of tolerance. And trauma-informed mindfulness really tries to encourage us to begin to first even ask, like, what is it like for me when I'm in my window? How do I know that? What does it feel like? And when we describe this window of tolerance, sometimes people think I'm always calm in that window. I'm always happy or easeful. And that's really what the window is it is a space where we're able to work with and be with and regulate whatever arises. I could be super happy, elated. I could be angry. I could be sad, still within my window that I'm working with it. And the trust piece begins to come in, that we begin to see maybe this opportunity that via practice, we're able to expand this window of tolerance by feeling invited and encouraged to stay with, perhaps be with certain uncomfortable situations, uncomfortable emotions, things that feel unpleasant that we might typically move away from, but always maintaining that sense and cultivating that sense of agency and autonomy. I always say, people, anybody I work with, you're always the expert within your body. And so creating that sense of skill to, is this a moment to be with? Is this a moment perhaps to move away from? Is this a moment to try to work with something or simply to be with it? So that exploration of trust via the relationship, I think, then helps to bolster that person's sense of trust within themselves.
Yeah, even with Emily in this scenario as well, kind
Yeah,
of also in her, I guess, expanding her speed of trust and being able to tell you, "Hey, I don't really flow with this breathing garbage," to her. And
yeah,
thinking that too. So how does trauma-informed mindfulness different from traditional mindfulness practices, and thinking, oh, well, this one doesn't work. Like, what else could I do, for Emily? And how is that distinction to those working with trauma survivors important?
it's a great question. So when I think about trauma-informed mindfulness, I wonder if we might even engage together, like in a brief experiential practice that kind of helps to explore a little bit of what this is. And then I could walk through a little bit more of a formal definition, or just some more formal ideas, I suppose, about it. But and like I said, always an invitation. So to you as well as the listeners, I'm going to put my hands up here just so you guys can see them. But if you were to participate, and to the listeners as well, feel free to have your hands kind of lower in your lap. But if we were to make a fist with one hand, and this fist represents processes in our body and our nervous system that are trying to attend to our safety and survival and security at its core. So the job of the fist is to stay closed as to protect our safety. So if we think about our bodies, our nervous systems as doing this. So if we were to take our other hand and then come towards that sense of safety and security and just try to pry it open a little bit, really try to kind of rip the fingers open a little bit, and then begin to try to feel what happens to our breath, what happens to our body. Sometimes people will tell me, like, oh man, my breath really like halted or accelerated, or I didn't even feel it anymore because I was holding it, felt a sense of tension throughout my entire body. So if we let that go a little bit, that sense of prying, make that same fist representing safety, security, trying to stay closed to protect that. And then if we took our other hand and we just tried to place it under the fist, just trying to create a bit of a nest so the fist can kind of rest into it a little bit. And then begin just to observe what happens in your body as you practice that. We might notice a bit of change in our breath, might notice a little bit of relaxation in our jaw or shoulders, kind of our body softening. And what I think trauma-informed mindfulness really is about trying to create a sense of a container, if you will, or a space. I often say, it's really the practice is the teacher, and that the facilitator is really just trying to co-create a sense of space where we can practice together. So that, and underneath, kind of represents this idea that we're trying to create at first a sense of like co-created sense of safety and security, and trying to communicate to these various adaptations that have occurred in people's body as to keep them safe and secure, to help them navigate as effectively as they can in their lives, that I'm not here to change that. I'm not going to try to rip this away in any way. We're trying to convey a sense of deep respect, like I understand why you're closed. Could even convey things like, wow, that's amazing that your body and nervous system adapted in this way, in such an effective way, to try to, at minimum, survive and even try to thrive in this challenging life that might be in front of you. So this is really the idea at its core of trauma-informed mindfulness. Now, a more formal definition, if you will, comes from SAMHSA, or the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Service Administration, and it's a 4R definition. I'll try to go through this very quickly. The first R is realizing the prevalence of trauma. We live in a world where probably 70% or more of us, I see some data suggesting maybe 90% of us, will experience something traumatic in life. Now, this doesn't mean that all of us will go on to develop a trauma disorder or post-traumatic stress disorder, but coming into life, this experience of humaning is one, for the most of us, characterized by something very difficult probably will happen over the course of our lives. Then for a subset of people, they might go on to develop maybe post-traumatic stress disorder or other trauma-related disorders, somewhere between maybe 6 and 9% of us. But going back to that ACE study, or the Adverse Childhood Experience study, the two main findings of that study were about the prevalence and the pernicious associations of trauma and health. And just from a prevalence perspective, what they found was that about 67% of people, 2 out of 3 people, had an ACE score, or this experience of abuse, neglect, or household dysfunction, parental separation, discord in the household, a family member that was incarcerated. About 67% of those people had an ACE score of 1 or higher. And about 13%, about 1 out of 8, had ACE scores of 4 or higher. So trauma and sort of adversity is very, very highly common. We oftentimes think about these experiences as happening to somebody else. And this is where I often will say, in any classroom, yoga room, boardroom that we're in, there's probably some holding of trauma and adversity. So the first R, this realizing the prevalence, I think helps us to begin shifting our sort of landscape, shifting our mental landscape. So when we're engaging with people, away from like, what is wrong with you, from a clinical perspective, like, what do we need to treat? What do we need to fix? What's wrong with you? To really opening up this question of what happened to you. What has your experience of life been like? How can we try to understand that together? So the first R, realizing the prevalence of trauma. The second R, really thinking about recognizing the symptoms of trauma, but I expanded to say recognize the symptoms of trauma as adaptations. All of our bodies, all of our nervous systems are trying to figure out how to survive and thrive in the life that they're in. So for some people, their symptoms or adaptations might be around something called hyperarousal, where their nervous system can very quickly get to an elevated state. So if you're living in an environment where it might have been really necessary to be able to get angry quickly, to go into this mode of protection very quickly, those were the adaptations that your nervous system made to survive. So hyperarousal, you might go out of your window of tolerance into this amplified or elevated state. Some people might go into a state, though, more of hypoarousal, like their nervous system gets quieter. They might look a little disconnected. They might look almost frozen at times. So the sense of recognizing the symptoms of trauma as adaptations, the second R, and really trying to explore with that person why those adaptations might have occurred. The third R is then responding skillfully. And this is where we begin to think more about like what might be adaptations, modifications to kind of quote unquote traditional mindfulness practice. One that we might think about is using objects of attention, like the breath is typically used. And certainly, I'm not trying to suggest we shouldn't or ought not use the breath. It's just about expanding the sense of objects of attention. So for some people, working with something outside of the body might be more regulating for them. And there's just one idea, but the idea of responding skillfully is consistently thinking about how are we listening and connecting with this individual as to then create practices that feel inviting and regulating for them. And then all of this towards the fourth R of avoiding re-traumatization. So, just to summarize very quickly, trauma-informed mindfulness is really about these 4 Rs: realizing the prevalence of trauma, recognizing the symptoms as adaptations, responding skillfully, and avoiding re-traumatization.
I was not expecting the genuine sense of anxiety when I tried to pull my fist apart in that exercise.
Yeah, it's very like it's a very compelling exercise. When I was first taught it similarly, I was like, wow, like my fist really put up a good fight. And like my whole body was like, that's not going to happen. And when we think about a lot of practices, and not just in the space of mindfulness, but as a clinician, as a psychologist, we all have to be attentive, all of us as providers, but just really all of us as human beings, are we engaging with ourselves in ways where we're trying to kind of pry ourselves open? When in fact, it might be like, how can I create that sense of nest, which then we might even begin to see, I think, just a softening of that hand more organically. I feel like when we create those and co-create those conditions, the organism, the person, the human being, the relationship just begins to move a little bit more gradually and easily towards wellness and healing.
And that leads beautifully into our next question, which is how can mindfulness practices, specifically trauma-informed mindfulness, help providers become more aware of their own trauma and how that impacts the care that they're giving to clients?
It's a great question. There's ongoing, right, discussion about should all providers be in some type of maybe psychotherapeutic modality. And I go back and forth and consistently think about that. And I think I still don't know if I've landed on an answer. I don't know if there is a definitive answer, but I think these practices, when we engage in any kind of practice that I think brings sustained, focused attention on our inner world, there's strong potential, of course, right, to bump up against a variety of things. And what we're trying to think about is that that's not inherently good or bad. More that has strong potential to occur. And are we engaging in the practices in such a way that we feel equipped and skillful and resourced to kind of ask ourselves in that moment, is this something to be with? Is it something perhaps that I need some space from? So I can kind of like a pendulum begin to develop a skillfulness of being with and moving away as necessary? Is it something to work with? So I think our practice in and of itself helps us to begin to cultivate some of those skills, being with, movement or pendulation, it's sometimes called, having that, and working with. And then, sorry, what was the second part of your question? And then how might it come into to work with others?
Yes.
Yeah, I think when we start at home, and there's a type of meditation that you're probably familiar with and listeners will be familiar with, but called metta, METTA, or loving kindness meditation. But I remember a teacher once, we were sitting together and she said, think of yourself like a vessel in a way, and you take the lid off and you have to fill yourself first with loving kindness. If we imagine it's like water flowing into a cup, you have to really fill yourself with loving kindness so that it just organically starts flowing out of you. Like there's no way to not have it flow outwards. So I think that when we engage in a practice or practices that help us to begin to ask ourselves more with more kindness and tenderness, like what's happened to me? What's been my story? What are some of the adaptations my body has made to survive and thrive in life? I think those questions and that embodiment really starts to come into the therapeutic space as well, that we begin to, I think, co-create that sense of that nest a little bit more easily, just naturally.
I don't want to say like, oh yeah, I think that's a great tip that people can use because I'm not doing it. But I think being able to differentiate themselves between their work and how that can affect themselves when hearing someone else, I think that there's a lot to be even said for just kind of being mindful of yourself, even if it's not trauma informed. Just
Mm,
mindfulness in general is also important for anyone of any profession in any walk of life. So, yeah, I think anyone who attends this training is really going to walk away with a lot of not only information, but things to think on how they maybe do their own practice, how they've already been engaging with clients or whatever communities they're working with up until then. And should I adjust things? Have I been doing this right?
mm.
And just kind of have those things in their mind going forward.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think, I often come back to a quote that I like, see if I can get it right. Listening and implicitly accepting is an incredible form of doing. I had a mentor in graduate school where we were watching an early tape of mine. And, at early stage therapist, he's like, I can tell you've like read the right books, because I was asking the questions probably just like plucked from the book itself. Like, he's like, I can tell you've read the books, you're keeping up with your homework, but he's like, I'm going to give you some guidance for your next session. I was a diligent student. I grabbed my pencil and paper and I was like ready for it. And he's like, listen. So I write down, listen. And I'm looking up at him and he's like, that's it. So I come into my next session really trying to just deeply listen. I agree with you. I think part of this experience is one of like really trying to begin to deeply listen in the course of our practice to like what stories come up within ourselves. We all have these narratives about ourselves, about the world around us. And the more that we can listen to those stories, I think we can relate to them in more effective ways, more useful ways for ourselves. And then again, I think that just begins to start naturally coming out into the world, like with folks we're engaging with. We really try to begin to deeply listen to their story. We're not trying to change anything. We're not trying to pry them open. Really about co-creating this space to really hear one another.
And I think that's a beautiful closer. And something I will be thinking about for the rest of the day. I'm always trying to remind myself to listen actively, but it's a lot easier said than done.
Yeah, no doubt. So, but I think like everything, I love the word practice, because we don't have to get somewhere, because the practice really is the path, right? If we're practicing that, we're going to veer off the path, just like our mind in mindfulness practice will wander left and right and up and down. Therein lies the practice. So we're going to be listening and then realize we're thinking about something completely different. Then we come back to the path, we come back to our practice. So yeah, thank you guys for this opportunity though to be in conversation with both of you. This was lovely.
Yeah, thanks for taking the time to speak with us. This has been not only educational, but I feel a little bit more at peace than when I came on this morning. So that's also nice too.
Great. I'm glad to hear that. So
thank you so much.
Thank you both. Thank you guys.
Links will be in the description to learn more about Dr. Koneru and sign up for his training, Trauma-Informed Mindfulness, Practices for Regulation and Resilience, on February 28th. Check out our links below to keep up with us at the Connecticut Women's Consortium. Thank you for tuning in today, and we'll see you next time.